If you were at this Mass last Sunday, we had a guest speaker, and I told you he was going to be in two parts. So Mr. Fletcher Murray is going to come up and give the second half of his reflection today. Thank you.
The last time I spoke to you, we did the hand-raising drill. You remember that? Today I'd just like to open very quickly with another drill where I would read from the book of Isaiah, and then I'd have you guys respond. So I would say, then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And then you would say, "Here I am, send me." This was to
It fits beautifully into this Sunday. In fact, this is the reason I asked him to split up his talk last week, because this piece talks about this transformation, or maybe you could say transfiguration. And today's scriptures are beautiful. The first two readings talk about the fact that we're holy, like God is holy. That's quite a statement. Of course, in the Bible, it's presented to us in the story of creation that we are made in God's image and likeness, and so we are holy as He is holy. When we come to the gospel, we see the holiness of Jesus, we see the Christ really, in this glorified moment, this transfigured moment. And we're asked to try to figure out what all this means. Now, of course, we can look at it literally that it happened exactly as it is said, and so in the first reading, last week, we had a serpent talking, and the serpent are going at it with a conversation. I've never heard of a talking serpent, so I'm not so sure it's literal. But even if it was literal, whether it's literal or not, it's a major metaphor. Well, the truth of it is still the same. I prefer to see it as a metaphor because I've begun to appreciate how the Scripture is filled with metaphor. Example after example that is meant to be in a metaphorical way about our life. And even though these things could have happened 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, they're very present and they're meant to engage us. So in the first reading last week, Eve's in the garden and she's eating from every tree in the garden except the one tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, I call the tree of confusion. Because that's what mixing up good and evil do. We get confused. And so the serpent tells her, eat from that tree. You won't die. God doesn't want you to eat from that tree because He says you think you'll be like Him. And He's afraid of that. So eat from the tree. So she does. And she does get confused. And she gives it to Adam, who gets equally confused. And all of a sudden they're aware of their nakedness and they're full of shame and they go to hide from God. That's confusion. And that's what sin does to us. When we become ashamed of our lives, we don't only hide from God, we hide from one another. And we oftentimes hide from ourselves. So Fletcher, since he was up there, I can use him as an example. Here he was, 22 years old now, or 23, but a young man, and here he was, he said he didn't know how to love before. He went through all the actions. Here he was doing something that others would say, oh, Fletcher, I'm so impressed, you and Nancy, oh my God, feeding the poor, and he could hold up his badge that he had. But he admitted himself, I wasn't doing this very lovingly until he got transformed. And what actually happened to Fletcher is that he went up on the high mountain with Jesus. And when he was up on this high mountain, Jesus was transformed, transfigured right in front of his eyes. And his own testimony was for the first time he saw clearly. There was no confusion, no fruit from the tree of confusion. But he was on the mountain of clarity, the mountain of truth. And he saw Jesus Christ in this person. That's what Mother Teresa used to say. When you look at the face of a poor person, you're looking at the face of Jesus Christ. And Jesus himself said, when you feed the hungry and you feed the poor and when you visit people in jail and clothe the naked, he said, when you do that to the least, you're doing it to me. He didn't say when you're doing it to your best friend or your husband or wife or children or parents. When you do it to the least, when you do it to your least, when you do it to your enemies, you're doing it to Him because that's where you will find Him. And it's when we get that we experience His transformation or transfiguration. In the gospel, it's pretty humorous to me, and the metaphor is to include us on that mountain experience. But if we go back to the page, what's on the page, there's Jesus there with 3 of His apostles, and they're talking. All of a sudden, something happens. He begins to be transfigured, transformed. It says His face was shining like with light, and His clothes were bright. And then suddenly, in this vision, there's Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets on either side of Him, and they're conversing. So Peter, the bright one, gets a light goes on in his head, and he says, I know what I'll do. I'll build 3 tents for you, and he's going to take over control of this great moment. But he gets interrupted because this cloud comes over, a bright cloud. It casts a shadow over them, and all of a sudden this voice comes out of the cloud, clearly the voice of God. And Peter and the apostles fall on their face, covering their face. They're so scared. And the voice says, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." And then the voice trails off. And Jesus comes over and touches them, and when they look up, it's only Jesus. Moses and Elijah are gone. He looks the same as he was before. But they had this moment. They had this moment where they saw Jesus in a completely different way. And the great metaphor is that you and I get invited up on the mountain. We have been already, and we get invited up many times. Maybe there's one great moment like this one that Fletcher will be able to tell until the day he dies. I can tell you the day that I was changed. It was this bald woman. This is what happened. That was his great mountain experience. But I'm sure he's had many since. Many since. And many of them wrapped around his ministry to the poor there, feeding the hungry. So, as we look at the metaphor, we could ask the question, do we remember when we first ate from that tree of confusion? One of the big ones, one of the big rotten apples that we ate, one that changed us negatively. And probably at least nibble on that apple every day in little ways, when we get impatient, when we're uncaring. But we all have probably a big rotten apple that we've eaten that changed our lives in a negative way. And we could ask, who have we offered the apple to? Who have we lured into temptation and sin because of our attitudes and ways of thinking? Who has been Eve to us? And when we look at it in a metaphorical way, we see that story. It's our story. We're in that Garden of Eden. And God says, don't eat from the tree of confusion, but we do it. But at the same time, Jesus himself leads us up on the mountain. We're on that high mountain, just like the apostles. And Jesus gets transfigured before us as he makes so clear his truth and his love, his word, his glory, inviting us to share in it. And I'd ask the same question, when do we remember going up on that mountain? When did we see Jesus, if we ever have, so clearly we understood or we understand who he is and what he's about and what he's inviting us to share in? When have we taken others up to that mountain? And when we look up and just see the Jesus of every day that we hear about, we say every day in the name of the Father and of the Son, that's Jesus, and the Father and of the Son. How many times do we do that in a day? How many times? Forming the cross over our bodies. How many times a day? And it's so routine, we probably don't sometimes even think about, maybe don't even say the words. I see people just kind of sweep over, just do a sweep. It's just routine. But there's sometimes it's not routine. We go up on that mountain and we see Jesus. And we get it. And this moment of clarity not only shows us Jesus transfigured, but the miracle is, the greatest part of this metaphor is, we get transfigured. We get transformed. The testimony of Fletcher again is, he's doing these works of mercy for the poor, and finding out that he's really doing them for himself as he begins to understand the meaning and impact and the transfiguring power it has over him. Today, here we're just in our second Sunday of Lent. We've got several weeks to go. And even if we made promises that we haven't kept, oops, I ate that chocolate yesterday again. Or like the young person who said to me last week, Father, I gave up donuts, but I ate one. Is it okay? I said, just start over. It's not about doing it perfectly. In fact, you may not know this. I may be breaking a huge secret. Do you know Sundays are not part of Lent in terms of our penance? So you're supposed to give up for all the days of Lent, but Sunday is a free day. Did you know that? Did you know that? So if you gave up chocolate all of Lent, on Sundays you can have it. If you have to crave it. If you said that same with cigarettes, don't change it on Sunday, okay? They're not good for you. Chocolate is good for you. But the point is, it's not about doing it right or doing it perfectly or checking it off or therefore being good because we followed our Lent. It's about going up on the mountain with Jesus. And if giving up chocolate does that for us, wonderful. If doing something extra, wonderful. But in any of it, what we're really supposed to do is look at ourselves, confront the ways that we are not growing, the ways that we're still eating from that tree of confusion, and asking, how can we become more clear? How can we allow Jesus Christ to transfigure our lives and make us more?